Hello everyone and welcome to another video. Now I was recently at my local CEX picking up some Xbox 360 games, as most of them cost like next to nothing these days, and while I was in there I noticed these two, a 25 quid Core i7 and a £50 graphics card, both of which date back to over 10 years ago. In the last video we saw how an overclocked i7 4790K still put up a decent fight when paired with a modern RTX graphics card, so today I thought we'd stick with a DDR3 setup, though this time we're focusing on an even more entry level point. But what a perfect time to do so with some of the crazy pricing out there. I don't hold out too much hope for this configuration, to be honest, but we'll see what it can do. We have the 4-core 8-thread i7 4770S today, a lower power quad-core chip from 2013, and the Nvidia GTX 980, a 4GB GPU that came out in 2014 and was a very capable choice for gaming at the time. Anyone looking to buy parts like this in early 2026 is probably on a limited budget, so I've paired these two with 16 gigs of DDR3 1600, that's two 8GB sticks, and we're using a basic H81 motherboard. The PCIe Gen 3 980 will run in Gen 2 mode, but it is a 16-lane card, so no big deal, we shouldn't see any major performance problems. I think the CPU is going to be the bottleneck anyway. We're also using Windows 11, which seemed to work. I just moved my SSD from my main PC to this board. An older version of Windows or a Linux distro of some sort would probably feel a lot smoother to use. 11 was tolerable, but it was sometimes sluggish. Multitasking was a bit of a nightmare. So, with our £75 or $100 combo ready to go, let's get into some games. In the last video I tested Battlefield 6 and some of you asked me how I got it to run on a 4th gen Intel chip. Well, to be honest, I don't really know. I didn't do anything, I just fired up the game and it worked. So it must have been the Z97 motherboard, because with this board, the H81 board, the game gave me a secure boot error, so it won't launch at all. I might make a separate video about this whole thing soon, just to make people aware that a better socket 1150 board may let you play the game on older hardware. But let's move on. So in the last one as well, a lot of you asked me to test Arc Raiders, and on the i7 4770S and the GTX 980 here, it will actually run. Now sometimes when I'm using graphics cards with lower amounts of VRAM, like 4GB cards for example, some of the textures just will not load in. I think you can probably pick that up here, like with some of the trees and fences in the distance, like they're just blurry blobs, but actually as we get close to them the texture detail will pop in, and this is something that doesn't always occur, so it's nice to see it happening here, unless there was some sort of in-game update. Now you're going to notice this throughout, but the CPU is pretty much the limiting factor here. That said, it does run nice and cool with my cheap Thermalright AK120 SE cooler once again, and in terms of power consumption we're looking at less than 60 watts overall here. Now there are a few dips and drops which can be a bit off-putting, and you'll mainly notice this when moving between different areas, but it's a plus 30 FPS average easily, and that's all I can really ask for with this aging combo. In fact, we saw at least 40 frames per second with 1% and 0.1% lows that weren't too bad. Now I'm going to do this a couple of times in this video, but I want to also show you gameplay with a cap implemented. I didn't do any exact benchmarking, but this could be a decent way to try and alleviate some of those stutters without making too much of a sacrifice. You know how like on the Steam Deck you can implement a 40 FPS cap, and it's sort of like a nice sweet spot between 30 and 60 FPS. Well, we can do that here as well using a program called Reaver Tuner, which comes bundled with MSI Afterburner, which is what displays all the stats on the screen. Now implementing a 40 FPS cap in some titles will make the dips and drops that you'll inevitably experience on a setup like this feel less intensive. So you might want to consider a cap with older hardware that could struggle a bit in newer games. I'm surprised this one's running as well as it is though, to be honest. Baldur's Gate 3 next with the medium preset and TAA. The average was about the same here as it was with Ark Raiders. We're looking at 45 FPS, though this one certainly exhibited more dips and drops, and I think this is mainly because of the CPU in and around those busier city areas. If we're not in the city, we're out doing some exploring elsewhere, then the frame rate will really pick up and it'll be a lot better to play, a lot smoother. But yeah, when things start getting a bit heavy on screen in terms of action and NPCs just roaming around, it is going to impact performance. So again, you may want to consider something like a 40 FPS cap, maybe even lower, maybe a 30 FPS cap. I found that 40 was fine here. There will still be drops below this, sometimes to the low 30s, but it felt a lot more consistent as opposed to those huge frame rate variations that we may see otherwise. Counter-Strike 2, no real complaints other than the fact I am terrible at this game. So where the most issues occurred was actually with like getting wiped out. As you can see, that happens to me a lot. I just get wiped out by enemy players a lot, and this is where the biggest frame rate hit comes in. So you get wiped out, the frame rate drops a little bit, and when you respawn, it drops a little bit again, but then it picks up. So if you're a better player than me, which isn't difficult, you shouldn't experience as many frame rate dips with hardware like this. Cyberpunk 2077 up next with the low preset. We actually left a few things on medium, or the preset leaves a few things on medium here. Again, just like in other titles, you're going to experience a decent frame rate in those areas that are less busy, like if you're in the Badlands in this game, for example, or you're in a part of the city that is less populated. The low preset actually means that the texture and crowd density settings are set to low as well, which is beneficial for our processor, but as we make our way into the heart of the city regardless, we're going to notice a few dips and drops, and our CPU is pretty much going to be pegged at 100% utilization anyway. We cannot overclock this processor. I don't even think we can do that as part of a higher end motherboard based system. So yeah, this is just a lower power chip that I picked up because it was available, and I don't think it's honestly too bad. It's not like those 35 watt i7T chips that will really decimate performance in certain areas. Again though, you may want to consider a frame rate cap this time. I chose 30 FPS, and yeah, it didn't feel too bad at all. I think I used to play on like PS4 back in the day at 30, so honestly it doesn't faze me all that much, but some of you may not be happy with that. When you do lock it to 30 though, it runs so much smoother, or so much more consistently, because there aren't those huge frame rate variations. But you've got to be willing to put up with 30 FPS in the first place. Speaking of frame rate caps, I tested Fortnite with a 60 FPS cap in place. Regardless, I only tested it with a cap because it was averaging like 62 with the low preset and 100% 3D res, and I thought I may as well cap it because it made it feel a lot better, and I think you're probably going to do or want to do the same with hardware like this. The percentile lows still weren't great, 35 and 15, but it felt a lot smoother with the cap in place than it did without, and considering this is a faster paced online title, I think it's beneficial to the overall experience. But it's entirely up to you, of course. It all comes down to personal preference. For GTA 5, we have the legacy or the original version of the game with the high settings. The sliders were set halfway here, the soft shadows were enabled, and all the advanced settings were off. FXAA was on for our form of anti-aliasing here. Now, there are no problems with this one. It's a pretty old game now. Again, most of the issues come from the CPU, which will struggle in those busier downtown areas, but it's a lot smoother in GTA here than it is in other games. There are no real problems with this one, so a decent experience throughout my 20-minute or so gameplay session today. Kingdom Come Deliverance 2 up next, one of my favourites from the last couple of years, one of my favourites from all time, to be honest. I was running it with the medium settings here, and I also implemented FSR 3.1 quality. I was sort of just roaming around the town and the forest area, trying to get the frame rate to dip a little bit. We actually saw 49 frames per second with these settings, which is pretty impressive considering the hardware we are using. Not quite maxing out the VRAM of the 980 either. Again, this is more of a CPU limitation. That's what you're going to run into most of the time. But even so, actually no. Looking back at the footage now, and it's certainly more GPU limited. This one doesn't really require much CPU power at all. This is a quad-core 8-thread CPU, and that seems to be enough, especially 4th gen onwards with Kingdom Come. Just don't go pairing something like this with a higher end RTX card because it will just be wasted performance. Performance left on the table, so to speak. Let's finalise with Red Dead Redemption 2 then. 1080p with a console equivalent, Xbox One X settings, I think according to Digital Foundry here. We also have TAA medium. The average was 54 frames per second, the 1% low was 38, and the 0.1% low was 18. So it dipped a little bit when we made our way into town. Similar story with all the other games really. But overall the experience here was, I'd say, really good considering. As far as a lower cost combo goes, I don't think this is too bad, but you may want to consider a different operating system. As for this one, well, let me know what you think down below in the comments as always. I think in the next video we'll be looking at a Ryzen build, so hopefully you can join me for them. We may have a couple of videos in between, but thanks as always for watching, and hopefully I'll see you all in the next one.